Hello, I'm Ben. This is Linda Mildred, and this channel shares many journeys of learning about projects that teach me about the living world. Come along as I compare literal and metaphorical growth to learn patience and science. Running a kitchen worm farm enables me to add fresh variety to several pets' diets, recycles kitchen scraps, reduces dependence on external supplies, creates free fertilizer for plants, and enables my family to contribute to a circle of life. Most other worm farms described online are much larger, from boxes to bins to barrels to commercial operations. My project today offers a simpler, smaller, easier starting point that anyone could make with items already in their kitchen. Worms are flexible, much like this project. The only essential component is just one container of any size that allows air exchange. The exact sizes and materials do not matter. I happen to use foil, spray adhesive, electrical tape, two containers of the same size, scissors, a marker, a rotary cutting tool, and a drill with a small drill bit. I made three at once since they're easy, and this way I have backups, plus the ability to do science experiments later on. Worms avoid light and dry surfaces. A thin-walled plastic container lets some light through, so adding aluminum foil to its outside creates additional darkness in its middle and around the worm food to encourage worms to spend less time there instead of at the bottom, where the humidity tends to be favorable. Leaving space for light to come through into the top discourages escape attempts, at least during the day, or if you store the container in a lighted area. Small air holes and keeping the container dry keep inhabitants inside. I haven't found any escape attempts after several months, though. Of course, spray goo can be substituted with any or no adhesive. I'm not providing measurements because your containers will be a different size from mine anyway. This design makes the base of a worm farm tower. I used two containers, an inner one with an outer one, so that I can more easily separate the worm castings from the materials the worms consume over time. The castings fall from the inner to the outer, where they are easy to remove for use as compost for plants or mycology. There's often a worm or two exploring the space between the two containers, which makes it a handy place to collect them for critter feeding time. But they can easily reach back up into the inner container for more food. You could stack containers to make a more proper tower, though. I recommend starting like this before adding complexity. I cut slots into the bottom of the inner container so as to hold back the worm food, with the idea that I might need to use a seafood pick to rake out the castings. However, after several months, I found that the slot width of around 1/4 inch to 1 centimeter, or even a bit larger, was sufficient that I did not need to scrape out the castings. The movement of the worms has been sufficient to pass along the castings, and I've also not had notable problems with foodstuffs falling through the grate prematurely. Perhaps because if any does, then some worms go to the lower area, eat it, and return to the inner container. Different species of worms prefer to live at different soil depths. I usually have a mix of species, and thus, due to the shallow container, some, like the night crawlers, work from the bottom up. Others, like red wigglers, end up working more from the top down. Later, I found that the castings in the outer container sometimes retain too much water, akin to undrained plant pots, though due to decomposition of too many greens instead of from overwatering. So I added air holes to the top of the outer container to enable ventilation without enabling leakage or creating escape points large enough for the worms. Inadvertently, this is also good design for compost piles, which can also benefit from being given ventilation to their undersides. For air holes, I based the diameter on the width of vents in a worm container from a local bait and tackle store. Notice that a very small number of small holes is sufficient for a high density of large worms, and the surface area is comparable for their container to mine. However, the worms will be nearly dormant and the food won't be breaking down like in a worm farm in their container. Therefore, I chose to add many more air holes. I used a 1/16 inch drill bit and made a grid without worrying about the exact number of holes or their spacing. From my experience with terrariums, I know that anywhere from half to twice as many holes will still enable decent humidity retention. Though a clear inner container initially gives a view into what's happening inside, in time, it'll become messy enough that it isn't a major benefit. So here are a couple of quick life lessons I take from projects like this. 1. Don't wait for perfection. I'm determined to learn from the imperfect so that I can move forward. And 2. I also try to find a smaller, simpler starting point than whatever was my first idea. For example, at first, I thought of making a bin out of wood pallets or 5-gallon buckets, like I'd seen others do. Yogurt and soup containers are big enough for a dozen worms, yet offer kitchen storage convenience that would not be practical with much larger worm farms meant for worms by the pound. Also, I temporarily misplaced a lid at one point, so I was able to make another to use until I found it. But I could just as easily experiment with changing the ventilation or other parameters. I cut scrap board roughly to the size of the grate to hold back the initial food because I've seen others do that online with larger farms. This is only needed if your initial worm foods happen to be smaller than the grate width. Leaves from your garden, houseplants, or salad would also work fine instead, and that's what I now use if I happen to fully clean out a farm container. Add a mix of mulch and castings or dirt as a starter habitat. For initial food, add only about as much in greens as the worms weigh, or the rest will likely rot. You can weigh your worms on a kitchen scale or get an estimate by weighing an average sized worm and multiplying by the number of worms you have. Include pinches of sand whenever adding food because worms need it to help with digestion. They don't have teeth, so like the way birds and certain other animals swallow small stones, the sand helps them grind food as they eat it. If you ever see liquid in the outer container, then you're adding too much fresh food. Slowly add an increasing amount of dried food until everything stays at the moisture level of a fresh garden soil. This will be a moving target throughout the year as ambient humidity changes, so keep an eye on it, and don't worry too much because the worms can tolerate a wide range. For common worms in the US, as long as you have 2 or more worms of the same species, they will lay eggs that hatch in about 3 weeks, then grow to adults after about 6 more weeks. Feed them slowly, such that they can make fresh or green foods disappear within about 2 days, dry or brown food like leaves or coffee filters disappear within a week or two, and again, that the moisture level stays like soil of a healthy garden or lawn. Depending on the species and your attentiveness, a single yogurt container could grow a population of dozens of worms. Look to rules for safe, small-scale composting to be good guidelines for what to feed worms, because worm castings are an early stage of compost on its way to becoming dirt. Subscribe for update videos in this playlist with more information about worm farm maintenance and worm care. I am also making videos about home science projects, mycology, terrariums, gardening, thoughts on life, and whatever I can to share this journey called life. What would you like to know more about, see next, or have me improve? I read all of the comments and am grateful for your time.